about hormones and the brain. It's really kind of an interesting chapter. So let's go ahead and get started. Maybe there we go. Animals use several types of chemical signals in the body to communicate or deliver information. There are there are different forms of communication. One is neurocrenes, which is a synaptic communication between the neurons, neurocrene. Autocrene, the hormone is activating the releasing gland. In other words, it's right next to it, so it's like an auto thing that's happening, automatic thing that's happening. Paracrine, para means around. Paracrine hormone is targeting a nearby cell. Para around. Endocrine hormone is passing through the blood to a distant target. And then pheromones, which communicate between different individuals of the same species. Neurocrine communication is synaptic communication. This communication is highly localized, as we have seen up to this point, and that's a neurocrine communication. Autocrine is in an autocrine cell, the secreted hormone is released by the cell, and then it finds receptors on their own cell to attach to. So an autocrine cell would release the neurotransmitter, and then it would be picked up by the same cell. This is the way the sugar control system of your body, the glucose control system of your body, uses a lot of autocrine cells. Paracrine cells release a chemical communicator that affects a nearby target cell. The strongest impacts are nearby cells, of course, and this is the paracrine system. This is also part of the glucose control system. Endocrine communication is through the release of a hormone into the bloodstream. The blood takes the hormonal signal to distant targeted organs, where the hormone changes the function of the targeted organs. And of course, we talk a lot about endocrine system, not so much about paracrine system or the autocrine system or the neurocrine system, but we talk a lot about the endocrine system. Pheromone function, hormones released into the environment are carried from their originator to another individual of the same species. Human females may release pheromones that regulate their menstrual cycles. We have seen this. We have seen dogs sniffing at other dogs' urine. Why are they doing that? What they are actually doing is trying to pick up the pheromones from that animal. They're trying to figure out if the other individual that they're smelling the urine from is a female. They're trying to figure out if it's a dominant male. They'll put off different pheromones, and that's one of the ways that they can control each other. Allomones, so we have pheromones. Pheromones are between species, the same species. Allomones are chemical signals that are released by one species and affect a member of another species. Flowers will release allomones to attract insects that will carry their pollen to another plant of their species. And unfortunately, this didn't happen in my apple orchard this year, and I don't have very many apples. So it looks like last year I pressed 22 gallons of cider. It looks like this year, if I get a couple gallons, I'll be lucky. Hormones frequently act in a gradual fashion. Behavioral and physical responses occur only after weeks of treatment and may last for several days. When hormones do alter behavior, they tend to act by changing the intensity or probability of a behavior. They do not act as a switch. The quantities and types of hormones released are influenced by the environmental as well as internal factors. High levels of testosterone cause aggressive behavior. The most aggressive individual wins an encounter and maintains their testosterone level, while the loser suffers a lowering of testosterone after the encounter. And they've actually measured the testosterone levels of people at a football game, and the winning team, the males tended to have a higher testosterone level, and the losing team, they tended to have a lower testosterone level. And this may be one of the reasons why, when there is a losing team, that the individual gets so angry that they want to fight the team that won. And the reason is because they're trying to raise their testosterone level. These are mostly fans. I'm not talking about the teams. They usually leave it out all out on the field, but sometimes the fans get a little bit hepped up, as it were. Each hormone has multiple effects on different tissue, organs, and behavior. Conversely, a single type of behavior or physiological change can be affected by many different hormones. Hormones are produced in small amounts and are secreted in bursts. Pulsating patterns are sometimes crucial for the small amount of hormone to be effective. Levels of many hormones vary rhythmically throughout the day. Many hormonal systems are controlled by circadian clocks in the brain. A good example of this is, wait a minute, ah, ah, rats. I should have thought about this before I gave this lecture. Cortisol. Cortisol is peaks at 8 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Controlled by the clock. We used to draw cortisol levels on pediatrics, young children who seem to have a stress problem. We were trying to figure out if how much cortisol they had early in the morning or in the afternoon. It's really kind of interesting too, because you had to do it by the second, and if you didn't draw it exactly at 8 o'clock and then exactly at 4 o'clock, then you got into a lot of trouble, and you had to get the blood right away. So it wasn't like, dig around for a couple minutes. That's not the way it had to work. Hormones affect the metabolic process in most cells and induce long-term metabolic change through the buildup and breakdown of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. The funny thing about drawing cortisol levels, we had one individual that got really nervous when they had to draw a cortisol level. Of course, you have to draw it right at 8 o'clock, not 8 o'clock in 15 seconds. You had to draw it right at 8 o'clock, and they were so anxious that they could never get it. They could never get it right. I had been through a lot of things, and I'd drawn blood in a lot of emergency situations. So they always sent me to draw the cortisols because I didn't get flustered by a time necessity. And we never sent that guy back. Oh, after he messed it up once, they didn't send him back. One morning, he was the only one working, and that was they asked the person to come back. Hormones affect the metabolic process in most cells and induce long-term metabolic change through the buildup and breakdown of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Hormones interact. The effects of one hormone can be markedly changed by the actions of another hormone. The chemical structure of a given hormone is similar in all vertebrates. The functions served across species can vary, of course. Number 10, the hormones can affect only cells that possess a receptor protein that recognizes the hormone and alters cell function. In different vertebrates, the same brain regions often possess the same hormone receptors. And of course, this has become a fairly controversial. We were giving steroids to beef cows to make them grow faster. And the question was, will beef steroids affect humans? And the answer is no. Same thing was happening with milk, with cow's milk. They were trying to determine, wait a minute, it was something else, wasn't it? It was a different type of almond milk. Almond milk has estradiol in it. But it's plant estradiol. It's not human estradiol. And the question was, will it feminize males? Was the question. And the answer, of course, is no. Neural communication works somewhat like the old wired telephone or telegraph system. Messages travel over fixed channels to precise destinations. The structure of the connections between neurons determines the transmission of information from one cell to the other to another. And that's the way telephones used to work. If there wasn't a wire connection between 2 points, then you couldn't communicate. It was the same way. This is one of the reasons why during World War One that they had to run a telephone wire across the battlefields in order for one part of the battlefield to communicate with the other. There actually had to be a wire communication. There was no communication that went through the air. There was actually, but it could be intercepted by anybody with a radio. Endocrine communication with a receiver, I'm sorry. Endocrine communication works like a television broadcasting system. Hormones are broadcast in the blood, and any number of scattered receptors throughout the body receive the message and respond to it. Neural messages are very rapid and are measured in milliseconds. Hormonal messages are slow and are measured in seconds or even minutes. Most neural messages are all or none responses. Hormonal messages are analog, graded in strength by the amount of hormone that is released. Neural responses are very often voluntary, while hormonal responses are not voluntary. They're involuntary. They just happen. Both systems store chemical transmitters for future release. Both systems are stimulated to respond by an outside source. Both systems are quite complex and maintain many differing chemical transmitters. Some hormones used by the endocrine system are also produced by neurons and used as transmitters. Both systems use transmitters that have specific receptors on the receiving target cells that respond to the stimulation. Both systems may produce a second messenger response in the targeted cells that brings about two levels of changes at the same time. There are three categories of hormones: protein hormones, amine hormones, and steroid hormones. Protein hormones are composed of strings of amino acids. Amine hormones are composed of a single amino acid. And steroid hormones are composed of 4 interconnected rings of carbon atoms rather than amino acids. Hormones promote the proliferation, growth, and differentiation of cells. Thyroid hormones present at birth support brain growth and development and growth. The thyroid hormone that we're talking about is T3 and T4. If there isn't enough, and TSH is the stimulating hormone. If there's not enough TSH, T3, and T4 in a baby's blood, then one of the things that we do is we start them on synthetic thyroid hormones. We have to do that, otherwise the brain won't develop. Once upon a time when we didn't have synthetic thyroid hormones, if a child was born with a low thyroid hormone level, then there was nothing we could do. Their brain didn't develop properly, and it didn't grow properly. And this was a condition known as cretinism, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, I think. Hormones modulate cell activity. Gonadal hormones modulate the onset and the maintenance of secondary sexual characteristics with puberty. Protein hormones and most amine hormones bind to receptor molecules on the surface of target cell membranes. This releases a second messenger in the cell. Because of the rapid process of protein binding, protein and amine hormones tend to act rapidly. Steroid hormones must pass through the cell membrane and bind to specific receptor proteins inside the cell. The combined steroid receptor complex then binds to the DNA inside the nucleus. The effect of gene expression may increase the production of some proteins and decrease others. And let me show you a video about second messenger systems in a minute, maybe.
For just $67, you can make as many videos as you want, and you never need to pick up a camera or use any fancy editing software.
has started doing this. Okay, here we go.
Epinephrine is one of many hormones that is water-soluble, hydrophilic, and therefore unable to cross the hydrophobic plasma membranes of its target cells. Instead, it binds to receptor proteins located in the plasma membrane and does not enter the cell. When epinephrine binds to beta-adrenergic receptors on the liver cell, G proteins on the inner side of the cell membrane are activated. Each G protein is composed of 3 subunits, and the binding of epinephrine to its receptor protein causes one of the G protein subunits to dissociate from the other 2. The G protein subunit which dissociates from the others carries a GDP, which is replaced by GTP when the subunit is activated. The activated G protein subunit then diffuses within the plasma membrane until it encounters adenylyl cyclase, a membrane enzyme that is inactive until it interacts with the G protein subunit. When activated by the G protein subunit, adenylyl cyclase catalyzes the formation of cAMP from ATP. The cAMP formed at the inner surface of the membrane diffuses within the cytoplasm, where it binds to and activates protein kinase A, an enzyme that adds phosphate groups to specific cellular proteins. In liver cells, protein kinase A phosphorylates and thereby activates another enzyme called phosphorylase, which converts glycogen into glucose 6-phosphate. The glucose 6-phosphate is then converted to glucose. Through this multi-step mechanism, epinephrine causes the liver to secrete glucose into the blood during the fight or flight reaction.
We've seen this second messenger system before. I mean, I've showed it to you before, and you can see how slow the process actually is. Okay. Most of the hormonal systems in the endocrine system control themselves through a negative feedback system. A gland detects a need to produce the hormone is produced, the need is taken care of, the gland is no longer stimulated by the need, the gland produces only enough hormone to take care of the level of the need. And that is the way the negative feedback system works. Insulin's negative feedback loop, glucose from a meal enters the bloodstream. The increased glucose triggers the pancreas to produce more insulin. The insulin enables the cells of the body to utilize the glucose for energy. As the level of glucose in the blood decreases, the pancreas is stimulated to produce less and less insulin. A balance is maintained. So what is diabetes type 2? Diabetes type 2 is a situation where the body becomes less sensitive to insulin. So what you need is to take a medication that increases the sensitivity to insulin. Metformin is one of the medications that you can take. There are other medications now. When I can remember when metformin was the only game in town, but they've developed other means of controlling type 2 diabetes now. The pituitary gland rests in a depression of the skull directly behind the nasal cavity. The pituitary gland consists of 2 parts, the anterior pituitary, which is constructed of glandular tissue, and the posterior pituitary, which is constructed of neural tissue. Back and front. Anterior means in the front, posterior means in the back. The pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus by a thin piece of tissue called the pituitary stalk. The axons of the hypothalamus reach into the pituitary gland, but only in the posterior pituitary, which, of course, as we know, is neural tissue. The axons from the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus stimulate the posterior pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin and arginine vasopressin. Okay, and we're going to talk about both of those hormones in just a minute. Because of the vascular structure of the posterior pituitary, both oxytocin and vasopressin are rapidly released into the bloodstream. Vasopressin is also known as antidiuretic hormone. This hormone helps conserve water by inhibiting the formation of urine in the kidneys. It is stimulated by areas in the supraoptic and paraventricular nucleuses that detect thirst and water needs. Oxytocin also is produced by the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin stimulates the contraction of the uterine wall that speeds up childbirth. Oxytocin also triggers the contraction of the cells in the mammary glands that allows the milk to be released from the breast. Because the process takes 30 to 60 seconds, the experienced mother will begin responding to her child's cries rather than the suckling. So she starts releasing milk as soon as she hears the baby crying for milk. While oxytocin allows other animals to reproduce, in humans it mediates sexual arousal and affection response. The anterior pituitary is made up of glandular cells rather than neural cells as the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is controlled by releasing hormones produced in the hypothalamus and are transported to the anterior pituitary through a network of capillaries called the hypothalamic pituitary portal system. The neuroendocrine cells of the hypothalamus that produce the releasing hormones are controlled by two influences. They receive neural impulses from other parts of the hypothalamus that either inhibit or excite their releasing capacity. Circulating messages from other hormones directly affect them. Corticotropin-releasing hormone, CRH, from the hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, that stimulates the adrenal glands to produce corticosteroids. Thyroid-tropin-releasing hormone, TRH, stimulates the pituitary gland to produce thyroid-stimulating hormone that stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. Prolactin-releasing peptide and prolactin-inhibiting factors are produced by the hypothalamus to control the amount of prolactin released from the pituitary gland. Prolactin controls lactation in women. Somatocrinin stimulates and somatostatin inhibits are produced by the hypothalamus to stimulate the pituitary gland to produce growth hormone, which controls bone growth. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone is produced by the hypothalamus, which stimulates the pituitary gland to produce luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. In the female, luteinizing hormone stimulates the release of ova from the ovaries and prepares the uterine wall for implantation. Follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates secretion of estrogen and influences overproduction. In the male, LH, luteinizing hormone, stimulates the testes to produce testosterone, and follicle-stimulating hormone influences sperm production. And so you might wonder, how many sperm are these males producing? By golly, how many sperm are they producing? And the answer is about 35,000 per second. Now, if you think, wow, that's an awful lot, the reality is that males need that many sperm in order to reproduce. Most of them don't make it into the ovaries, into the fallopian tubes, where they need to go in order to impregnate somebody. The adrenal glands are situated on top of each kidney. Like the pituitary gland, the adrenal glands are divided into two portions, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Was that right? I need to check something. I just gave you guys a little piece of information that sounds like trivia. Let me look that up. How many sperm per second on average in a human? 1,500 per second, I'm sorry. Actually, the and this is no excuse on my part. I should have looked this up before I even talked about it. But sperm counts have been going down in humans ever since the end of World War II. So, like it was 35,000 in 1947, and it is 1,500 now per second. No, that's not true. Accuracy, of course, is a problem. I was incorrect. So the actual answer is 1,500 per second. So how many do you need to impregnate somebody? Well, what is normal sperm count now? Well, let's look up normal sperm count. And the reality is this has been going down. Normal sperm density range from 15 million to greater than 200 million per sperm per milliliter of semen. You were considered to have a low sperm count if you have fewer than 15 million sperm per milliliter or less than 39 million total per ejaculate. And there you go. And all of this has to do with how many viable sperm you have. So motility is important. Abnormal forms are important. I used to do this when I was when I worked in the lab. I did sperm counts, and one of the things that you had to do was look at the sperm to find out if they were normal or not. Some of them just swim around in circles. That one's not going to ever impregnate anybody. Some of them didn't have all the parts that they needed. It's made up of three basic parts. It's got a tail, an energy pack right behind the head, and then it's got a head. And the head has to be shaped in a certain form. If the head was, some of them are overly large. Some of them were very tiny. If there was no energy pack, if the tail was too short, or the tail wasn't moving, that the sperm was dead. We had to look at all of these things in order to determine if the individual was who potentially came in because he was having problems impregnating his significant other. Normally, that's what we were doing. We're trying to determine if the reason was because of a low sperm count, because of poor sperm motility. And one of the things we discovered, and this may break a lot of people's hearts, but one of the things that we discovered was the people who smoked too much pot, smoking marijuana, which is legal in many states, they had more abnormal forms than just about anybody else. But you can't use pot as to keep from impregnating somebody. The adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are situated on top of each kidney. Like the pituitary gland, the adrenal glands are divided into two portions, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla, wait a second, there we go. The adrenal medulla, yeah, okay. The adrenal medulla releases the amine hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal cortex produces and secretes some of the steroid hormones, the adrenal corticoids. The glucocorticoids affect the metabolism of carbohydrates. Cortisol is an example of a glucocorticoid. A second group of adrenal steroids is the mineral corticoids, which affect the ion concentration of sodium in the kidneys. Aldosterone acts on the kidneys to reduce urine output and conserve sodium, thus also conserving water, aldosterone. The adrenal cortex also produces sex steroids. The chief sex steroid produced by the adrenal cortex is androstenedione, the steroid that Mark McGwire was using when he broke the Major League home run record. Androstenedione contributes to adult hair growth patterns in men and women. An overabundance in a woman can lead to a more masculine hair growth pattern. And this has to do with wherever hair grows. It has to do with armpit hair becomes thicker, hair on top of her head potentially becomes thinner, and hair in her pubic region grows up to her navel, can potentially grow up to her navel if she's taking too many steroids. And that is examples of male hair growth patterns, as you can see. The adrenal cortical hormones are controlled by ACTH released from the pituitary gland. Stress is detected by the hypothalamus and releases CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, to induce the pituitary to release ACTH. Unfortunately, the glucocorticoids released because of the ACTH, when released in high levels, can kill nerve cells in the hippocampus. Thyroid gland is located around the esophagus, just below the voice box. And of course, if you're a male, you can feel your voice box. It's your Adam's apple, that's your voice box. So your thyroid glands are right below that. 3 hormones secreted from the thyroid include thyroxine and triiodithyrone and calcitonin. The hormones are stored in the thyroid colloid, and you've got about 100 days of it. The thyroid maintains a large supply of hormones, about 100 days worth. Calcitonin promotes calcium use in the bones. T4 and T3 levels are regulated by TSH released by the anterior pituitary. T3 and T4 are amines but act as steroids, passing through the cell membrane, finding a receptor in the cell, and then binding to the DNA. T3 and T4 are released from the thyroid gland because of the influence of TSH from the pituitary gland, which is induced to release TSH when stimulated by thyrotropin releasing hormones secreted by the hypothalamus. Now, all this can get messed up, and we have a thyroid function problem. If we have too much T3 and T4, one of the things that happens is the person becomes hyper. They burn all their calories. They become very slender because of a malfunctioning thyroid. If the T3 and T4 are too low, then the person becomes sedentary, fairly sedentary, and they have a difficult time finding enough energy to do anything. While the too much hyperthyroidism causes somebody to look like they're on crystal meth or cocaine, T3 and T4 hypothyroidism makes them overweight to the point of obesity, and that can be a really serious problem. So one of the things that doctors do when somebody comes in who's overweight or somebody comes in who's really slender, a lot of times they'll do a thyroid function test to determine if the T3 and T4 are functioning properly. And if they're not, they can always put someone who is hypothyroid. They can put them on thyroxine, which is a synthetic or Synthroid is the synthetic. Or they can, if somebody is hyperthyroid, the only thing that they can do is take out the thyroid gland and start regulating with synthetic hormones. The thyroid hormones are critically independent they're critically dependent on iodine. An inadequate supply of iodine will lead to hypothyroidism. Since the thyroid output is inadequate, the pituitary produces more and more TSH to compensate, but only succeeds in enlarging the thyroid in a condition known as goiter. In the United States, this is combated with iodized salt. There's a reason why humanity developed along the seashore, and that's so that the humans could consume enough iodine. If they lived too far inland, then they weren't getting enough iodine, and potentially they developed goiter and didn't live very long. But if they lived along the seashore, they were getting adequate iodine. And this is one of the reasons why humanity developed around the oceans because they needed the iodine. Until 1924, goiter was endemic in areas of the United States where iodine from seafood was not prevalent. In Michigan, a study in 1923 showed a 39% prevalence rate among school children. In Ohio, 31% of the school children were estimated to have goiter. In West Virginia, goiter was rare as long as local brown salt was being used. It was salt that had iodine in it. When pure white salt replaced the brown in 1922, the study showed 61% of the school children had enlarged thyroid glands because of the lack of iodine. And this is one of the reasons why we consume iodized salt. People that lived close to, let's see, how can I explain this? There used to be an inland sea in where the United States is. And that inland sea ran from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi River. And this was an inland sea. So any of the salt that was deposited there, that salt came from the inland sea. And the inland sea at that time, of course, had seafood in it that had iodine. So the iodine got into the salt. So people living in that area were okay, but people living between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains, those people weren't getting enough iodine, and that's one of the reasons why Michigan, Ohio, and West Virginia. Well, West Virginia actually was close enough to the East Coast that they had brown salt, but when they stopped eating brown salt and started eating, the refined white salt, then they had a really serious problem. And this was a problem. My mother, I talked to my mother about this. My mother was born in 1915, and of course they didn't start iodizing salt until the 1920s. And the Morton Salt Company was the first company to start iodizing salt. And of course everybody just started consuming it. One of the problems with iodized salt, it tastes different than sea salt does, or regular salt actually. So that was a problem because it has a tang to it. It has an iodine tang to it. If you've ever tasted iodine, it's fairly bitter. Anyway, so there you go. But I talked to my mother. She was born in 1915, and she was talking about there were, half the kids in where she grew up had problems with goiter. We're from Indiana, and her family didn't because her grandfather, or her father, no, her grandfather used to bring home seafood whenever he could find fresh seafood. So they tended not to have any problems with goiter. As a fetus is developing, if the thyroid hormones are not high enough, they will cause stunted growth, facial malformations, and reduction in brain size. The baby will also suffer from intellectual disability in a condition known as cretinism, and we've already talked about it. And this is what cretinism looks like. If you have a baby that's born, they look chubbier than other babies, and they also they can't pull their tongue back into their mouths. This is really kind of weird. But yeah, if you've ever seen a baby that looks like this, if you put them on synthetic thyroid hormones, then right away, right after birth, then you can actually save this baby's intellectual capabilities. The male gonads are the two testes located in a sac beneath the penis. Each testis produces millions of sperm a day through Sertoli cells. In and among the Sertoli cells are Leydig cells, which secrete testosterone. Testosterone and other androgens are regulated by luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland. Luteinizing hormone is controlled by the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. The female gonads are the ovaries. They are located above the vagina at the very bottom of the abdominal cavity. There are two ovaries, one on each side of the uterus. The ovaries produce progestins and estrogens. The most important estrogen is estradiol. The primary progestin is progesterone. Estrogens trigger the production of progestin receptors in the brain, hence with puberty, progestin sensitivity ushers in the menstrual cycle after estrogen is secreted from the ovaries. All three sex hormones, androgens, estrogens, and progestins, have a similar chemical structure, 4 interconnected carbon rings. The sex hormones, along with the adrenal steroids, are derived from cholesterol. Estrogens are synthesized from androgens, and androgens are synthesized from progestins. Both males and females have the same sex hormones, only in different proportions. Unlike most brain structures, which are paired, there is only one pineal gland. It lays at the bottom of the brain stem. The pineal gland produces the amine hormone melatonin. Melatonin receptors are metabotropic, thus they activate G proteins. Since melatonin activates metabotropic receptors, reaction to it is slow. Melatonin regulates the circadian rhythm and the reaction to light and dark. Melatonin can be used to move the sleep cycle up in the night, but because it has a metabotropic receptor, it only works over time. And this is one of the reasons why if you decided that you wanted to go to sleep early tonight, you couldn't take a melatonin pill and it knock you out at 8 o'clock. It doesn't work that way. It takes time to build up in the system. The pancreas serves two main functions. It produces digestive enzymes, and as an endocrine gland, it secretes insulin and glucagon. The endocrine gland portion of the pancreas is a series of specialized cells called islets of Langerhans. Both glucagon and insulin affect glucose utilization by the body's cells. The peptide hormone insulin is produced in beta cells within the islets of Langerhans, while the glucagon is produced in alpha cells of the islets. When glucose rises to a select point, insulin is released into the bloodstream. The insulin induces the cells to use more glucose and reduces the amount of glucose being released by the liver, lowering the blood sugar level. Glucagon serves the opposite purpose of insulin. When the pancreas detects a low blood sugar level, glucagon is released and it induces the liver to release glycogen. There is a paracrine action between the alpha and the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans. And that is the end of the chapter. So I'll talk to you guys next week. I know I'm a chapter ahead. I apologize, except I really don't. So I'll talk to you next week.